Julian Lombardi, a strict and emotionally distant billionaire, never imagined that the quiet maid in his home would be the one to bring light back into his grieving son's life. One ordinary afternoon, he stumbled upon a moment that stopped him in his tracks, and what he uncovered next would change everything he thought he knew. Why was this mysterious woman teaching his son to dance? And what secret was she hiding? Stay until the end for a powerful twist that will touch your heart. If this story moves you, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Julian Lombardi's mornings always began the same way: precise, quiet, and heavy with silence. In a mansion filled with marble halls and priceless paintings, the sound that echoed most often was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. Time was all he had now. It moved forward with ruthless consistency, even when his heart had stopped 20 years ago, on the day his wife took her last breath. Since then, life became nothing more than a series of scheduled meetings and hollow successes. He had built an empire, yes, but lost the only warmth that had ever made it feel like home. He thought he had control, but grief has a quiet way of slipping past the walls we build. It was a gray Wednesday afternoon when something unusual happened, something that made Julian Lombardi stop in his tracks. He had been walking his usual path through the eastern quarter of the house, a place he often passed without so much as a glance, but this time something outside the tall garden windows caught his eye. At first, it didn't register. He blinked, uncertain if he was imagining it. Then he stepped closer. There, on the rain-damp grass beneath the trembling branches of the willow tree, was his 12-year-old son, Leonardo. But he wasn't alone. With him was Isabella, the house cook, a quiet woman with tired eyes and a voice soft as chamomile. She was dancing. No, not just dancing, she was teaching. Leonardo's steps were awkward, unsure. He stumbled once, then again, but each time he laughed, a full-bodied, sunlit kind of laugh Julian hadn't heard since his wife passed. And Isabella, her movements were like poetry, graceful, measured, not the gestures of a kitchen worker, but of someone who once knew the rhythm of the stage, someone who had lived through music, not just survived in silence. For a moment, Julian couldn't move, couldn't speak. The sight of his son, smiling, truly smiling, struck something deep in his chest. But along with the wonder came a pang of confusion and a spark of unease. Why hadn't he known about this? Why had Leonardo turned to someone else, to a stranger, for something so personal? The rain had begun again, a soft drizzle painting the windows. Julian stepped back from the glass, the image of his son and Isabella etched in his memory. Something had changed, and for the first time in years, Julian didn't know how to feel about it. The next morning, the air in the Lombardi household felt different. Julian sat alone at the long oak dining table, sipping his usual black coffee, but the taste was hollow. His mind wasn't on the day's meetings or market numbers. It was on the garden, on the memory of his son's laughter, and on the quiet woman who had caused it. Julian didn't like things happening outside of his awareness, especially not in his own home. By mid-morning, he found her. Isabella was in the kitchen, her hands dusted with flour as she kneaded dough for the evening bread. She looked up as he entered, brushing a stray curl from her cheek, calm as always. "Signor Lombardi," she said, offering a nod. "Is there something you need?" Julian didn't waste time. He reached into the inner pocket of his blazer and pulled out his phone. With a few swipes, he placed it on the countertop, displaying the article he had found the night before. "You didn't mention this when I hired you," he said, his voice steady but sharp. Isabella's eyes moved slowly to the screen. There it was, a younger version of herself, frozen in time, captured mid-leap on the stage of a grand theater, bathed in spotlight. The headline read, "Rising ballet prodigy disappears from the world stage." She didn't speak right away. Her hands stilled, her expression unreadable. And then finally she whispered, "You've been searching for me." "I don't like mysteries under my roof," Julian replied. There was a long silence. Then Isabella folded her hands, flour clinging to her skin like pale scars from another life. "I was a dancer," she said quietly. "Once." Julian crossed his arms. "You were more than that. You were famous. People expected you to become the next big name in ballet. What happened?" Isabella let out a breath that trembled slightly. "I lost someone," she said simply. "The one person who believed in me before anyone else did. He was a dancer too, my fiancé. We had spent years building a future, until one day a car didn't stop." The words hung between them like mist. Julian's brow furrowed, his arms slowly lowering to his sides. "And after that?" "I couldn't dance anymore," she replied. "Not because my body couldn't, but because my heart couldn't. Every step felt like betrayal. Every note reminded me of him." He didn't speak, not out of rudeness, but because he didn't know how. Loss had a sound of its own, one he had long forgotten how to respond to. "I took this job," she continued, "because it was quiet, because it let me disappear." Julian was quiet for a moment. Then his voice softened just slightly. "Then why did you start again with Leonardo?" Isabella looked up, and for the first time her eyes seemed to glimmer. "Because he asked," she said, "and because he reminds me of myself at his age, quiet, guarded, carrying something heavy, and because when he dances, he smiles. A real smile. You've seen it, haven't you?" Julian clenched his jaw. Yes, he had, and he couldn't unsee it. Julian stood there in the quiet of the kitchen, the faint scent of baking bread in the air. Yet all he could sense was the echo of Isabella's words. "You stopped dancing because of grief?" Isabella didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed on her hands, on the flour dusted across her palms, as though they still bore the memory of movements she no longer made. "I stopped," she whispered, "because dancing without him felt like standing on stage with no music, like breathing in a world that no longer had air." Julian's chest tightened. He had known pain, yes. The loss of his wife had carved out a hollow space inside him that success and structure never filled. But this was different. Isabella had walked away from everything she had ever known, not because she wanted to, but because every performance was a reminder of what she had lost. "He was called Adrian," she said softly, as though speaking his name aloud could conjure the past. "We met at the age of 7 at a community dance class in Queens. We trained side by side every day, through blistered toes, missed birthdays, and failed auditions." She smiled faintly, wistfully. "He used to tell me that when we danced, the world disappeared. And when we finally made it, when we were invited to join a European ballet tour, it felt like a dream we had built with our own hands." Julian felt his throat tighten. He didn't dare interrupt. "The night before our flight to Paris," she continued, "we went out to celebrate. A silly dinner, wine, laughter. We danced in the rain afterward, on an empty street under a broken street lamp." Her voice grew quieter, and then he stepped off the curb. Silence. Heavy, aching silence. Julian turned his gaze away as if to give her the dignity of grief without a witness. "I tried to dance again," Isabella said after a pause. "I really did, but my heart, it stayed behind on that sidewalk. And so," she added with a slight shrug, "I became someone else. I cooked. I cleaned. I stayed small." Julian finally looked at her. "Until my son asked you to dance." "Yes," she replied, "and I saw in him what I had once felt. That ache to express something you don't have words for." And I couldn't say no, not to him. Julian's voice was rough when he finally spoke again. Do you think, do you think he could be good? She turned to face him fully, her gaze steady. I think he already is. Not because he's perfect, but because he feels. And that's what dance is, Senor Lombardi. It's not about steps, it's about feeling. Julian nodded slowly, the words settling somewhere deep inside him, in a place even he didn't often visit. I see, he said quietly, and for the first time in a long time, he meant it. It was just after dinner, and the golden chandelier above the dining table cast a warm glow across polished wood and untouched dessert plates. Julian sat at the head of the table, nursing a small espresso, his mind already drifting to morning meetings and quarterly projections. The silence in the room was comfortable, routine, predictable. Then Leonardo stood up, not abruptly, not with drama, but with a quiet firmness that made Julian raise his eyes. Dad, Leonardo said, his voice low but steady, I want to enter a dance competition. The cup froze halfway to Julian's lips. For a moment, nothing moved. Even the soft ticking of the antique clock on the wall seemed to pause. You want a what? Julian asked, setting the espresso down without drinking it. Leonardo stood his ground. There's a youth dance tournament next month. Isabella told me about it. She says I'm ready. The name Isabella hung in the air like perfume. Julian leaned back, crossing his arms. Since when have you wanted to compete? I've been training every day, Leonardo replied. I know you didn't see it at first, but it's something I want, really want. Julian was silent, weighing the request like a contract. He looked at his son, not the shy, bookish boy who once hid behind his mother's skirts, nor the child who flinched at loud voices and lived in silence after her passing. No, the boy standing before him now had fire in his eyes. Nerves, yes, but also resolve. Competitions aren't child's play, Julian said, his voice cool. Their pressure, their rejection, their public judgment. You have to be prepared to fail. I am, Leonardo replied without hesitation. And if I do, I'll get better. But I want to try. Julian stared at him. He wanted to say no, to protect, to control, but something, maybe the faint echo of his late wife's voice or maybe Isabella's quiet conviction, held him back. If you do this, he said slowly, you do it fully. No excuses, no quitting halfway. You'll train hard. And if you lose, you'll do it with your head held high. Leonardo's face lit up. Not with relief, but with pride. I will. Thank you, Dad. Julian gave a small nod. You'll begin formal training tomorrow. And I want to see every session. Leonardo grinned, the kind of grin that brought color to the boy's pale cheeks and made something in Julian's chest stir. That night, Julian sat in his study longer than usual. He found himself staring not at financial charts, but at a pair of ballet shoes resting quietly near the coat rack. Leonardo's. Worn, softened, and slightly frayed. He thought of the boy's voice, trembling, but sure. I want to try. And for the first time, Julian realized he wanted him to try too. The next morning dawned with a sharp chill in the air, but inside the estate's private studio, the air was warm, thick with quiet anticipation and the soft hum of classical music. Julian stood by the tall windows, arms folded across his chest, watching closely as Isabella and Leonardo entered the room together. Gone was the playful air of backyard twirls. In its place stood quiet discipline. Leonardo wore a fitted training outfit, his hair brushed neatly, his back straight. He didn't fidget or shuffle as he once did. Instead, he took his place in the center of the room, shoulders squared, jaw set. Julian glanced at Isabella. No soft touches, he warned. I want him pushed. corrected, not coddled. Isabella didn't look at him, but her words were steady. I wasn't planning on going easy. Julian said nothing more. He stepped aside, choosing to observe rather than interfere. The music began. At first, Leonardo stumbled. His feet missed a beat, his arms didn't rise smoothly. But Isabella was swift, stepping forward to correct his posture. Again, she said. Her voice wasn't harsh, but it was unwavering. Count it out. Feel the rhythm before you move. Leonardo nodded and began again. This time he was steadier, his steps more deliberate. But when he faltered in a leap, Isabella didn't let it pass. Reset, she said. You're rushing. Breathe. Control your landing. Julian watched, his critical eyes softening with every minute. It was strange. For years he had dismissed the arts, considering them distractions from purpose, from order. But now, as his son moved across the floor, drenched in sweat yet unwavering in spirit, Julian began to understand this wasn't about art, it was about resilience. Hours passed. The sunlight shifted and the sheen of effort shimmered on Leonardo's brow. Finally, Isabella clapped once. Enough for today, she said. You did well. Leonardo dropped to the mat, panting, his legs trembling. He looked up at her and managed a small, crooked smile. Did I really? Isabella handed him a towel. Yes, but we're just beginning. Julian stepped forward, his footsteps echoing softly in the studio. He looked down at his son, then to Isabella. He's serious, Julian said quietly. I didn't expect that. Isabella met his gaze. He's stronger than you realize. Julian glanced at his son, sweaty, exhausted, but glowing with something fierce and bright. Pride. Maybe even joy. Good, Julian said at last, because if he wants to compete, he'll need to be. Over the following weeks, the rhythm of the estate changed. Gone were the usual quiet mornings where only the rustle of newspapers and the clink of silverware filled the breakfast table. Now there was the sound of classical music drifting through the hallways, the rhythmic pound of feet striking the studio floor, and the occasional sharp correction from Isabella's calm but firm voice. Julian found himself drawn to it. At first, he'd pass by the studio on his way to the office, pretending not to care. But then his steps began to slow, then stop. Eventually, he stood in the doorway almost every morning, silent, arms folded, watching. He told himself it was just curiosity. But in truth, something deeper had begun to stir within him. He had never been a sentimental man. Emotion was inefficient. Feelings got in the way of precision. But now, as he watched Leonardo move, again and again, stumble, correct, reset, repeat, Julian felt something he hadn't in years, hope. One afternoon, as golden light poured into the training room through the tall windows, Julian stepped inside and sat quietly in the back. He didn't speak. He didn't interfere. He just watched. Leonardo was drenched in sweat, face flushed with effort, but his movements were sharper now, more intentional. There was focus in his eyes, not just determination, but something freer. A kind of joy Julian couldn't remember seeing since before she passed, before their house grew quiet, before laughter felt like a memory. From the corner of the room, Isabella caught Julian watching. She didn't say anything, but a small nod passed between them. It wasn't approval, it wasn't victory, it was understanding. That night at dinner, Leonardo was quieter than usual, but there was a glint in his eye. He was different now, not in a loud, boastful way, but in the way his shoulders stood taller, in the way he asked questions, in the way he smiled, like he had a secret he was proud of. Julian poured a glass of water and set it down in front of his son. You held your form better today. he said casually. Leonardo looked up, surprised. You watched? Julian didn't look at him directly. Sometimes. Leonardo's eyes lit up. He didn't say anything more, but the look he gave his father said it all. Thank you. Julian didn't need the words. He understood. And for the first time in years, he felt like he was starting to understand his son, too. It was late. The dining room was quiet except for the soft clink of cutlery and the occasional hum of the wind brushing against the windows. Julian sat at the head of the long oak table, reading the day's reports on his tablet. Across from him, Leonardo poked at his mashed potatoes, barely taking a bite. Julian noticed. For days now, Leonardo had trained with unwavering intensity. Each morning brought new challenges. Each evening ended in aching limbs and sore muscles. But tonight, something was different. The spark in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by a quiet cloud of worry. Julian set the tablet down. Something wrong with the food? He asked, his voice calm. Leonardo blinked, startled. No, it's fine. Then what is it? There was a long pause. Leonardo looked up, his fork resting still in his hand. There's a dancer in the tournament, he began, voice low. His name is Santiago Beltran. He's won 2 years in a row. Julian leaned back slightly. And? Leonardo hesitated. He sent me a message. Said I shouldn't even bother showing up. That I'll never be good enough. Silence. Julian studied his son. The boy's shoulders were hunched, not in defeat, but in confusion. A young heart wrestling with the weight of doubt. He could have brushed it off, told him to ignore it. But he didn't. Instead, he said, when someone goes out of their way to bring you down, it's usually because they're afraid. Leonardo looked up, confused. Julian continued, you don't spend time mocking someone who doesn't matter. If Santiago took the time to say something, it means you're already in his head. You're a threat. You really think so? Leonardo asked, eyes searching. Julian nodded. I've seen enough boardrooms to recognize intimidation when I see it. He's trying to scare you. Don't give him the satisfaction. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then slowly a small smile broke across Leonardo's face. Then I guess I just have to prove him wrong. Julian smiled back, just a little, but it was real. Exactly. That night, as Leonardo headed off to bed, his steps were lighter. Not because the competition was easier, but because someone believed in him. And that someone was his father. The Grand Theater buzzed with energy. Backstage, dancers stretched, whispered final instructions to themselves, or paced nervously beneath the glow of flickering bulbs. Costumes sparkled. The air was heavy with the scent of hairspray, rosin, and adrenaline. Somewhere in the wings, a piano hummed its final tune before curtain rise. Leonardo stood still amid the case. Hands trembling as he tightened the straps on his dance shoes. This wasn't the living room or the practice floor. This was real. This was where his effort, his fear, and his hope would all take the stage. He exhaled hard. Behind him, Isabella approached quietly. She wore a simple navy dress, her hair neatly pulled back. No apron, no flower on her sleeves. Tonight, she was not the cook. She was the mentor. She placed a hand on his shoulder. Breathe, she whispered. Leonardo nodded, swallowing back the nerves that clawed at his throat. You've done the work, she said softly. Now let the work speak for itself. Across the room, Julian stood in the shadows. He hadn't spoken much since they arrived. He didn't offer advice or encouragement, not in words, but his presence said enough. He had made time for this. He was here, and that meant everything. From his place backstage, Leonardo could see the edges of the stage curtain. Beyond it, rows of red velvet chairs, golden balconies, chandeliers hanging like stars. And somewhere out there, his father. The announcer's voice echoed through the space. Next on the stage, Leonardo Lombardi. Time froze. Leonardo's breath hitched. He turned, eyes searching the audience from behind the curtain. There, Julian sat tall in the front row, hands folded, eyes locked on the stage, his expression unreadable, but focused. Next to him, Isabella gave the faintest nod. Leonardo took his place center stage. The spotlight bathed him in white. The crowd faded. The noise dissolved. For one beat, he stood still. Then the music began, and he danced. Leonardo moved with grace that belied his age. Each step was deliberate, rooted in long hours of quiet work, mistakes, correction, and growth. He leapt, not to impress, but to express. He spun, not for the judges, but for himself, for his mother who once danced with him in the living room, for Isabella who saw past his silence, and for Julian who sat watching, unsure of what to feel. Julian hadn't expected to be moved. But as he watched his son glide across the stage, he felt something loosen in his chest. A swell of something he hadn't felt in years. Pride, yes, but also regret and awe. For too long, he had viewed Leonardo through a narrow lens, structured, serious, quiet like himself. But here, under the lights, he saw the boy as he truly was, alive, free. The music swelled to its final crescendo. Leonardo's body leapt into a final spin, feet catching the air, landing gently on the floor. He stood tall, chest heaving, eyes glistening with tears held back, not from sadness, but from the power of release. And then the theater erupted in applause. Julian rose to his feet instinctively, his hands coming together louder, faster than anyone else's. For a long moment, their eyes locked across the hall. No words passed between them. But Leonardo saw what he needed: acceptance and love. The announcement of winners followed soon after. As the judges deliberate, we want to take a moment to recognize one dancer, the announcer said, voice steady. This award is not for technical perfection, but for emotional depth, for expression, courage, and heart. The Artistic Spirit Award goes to, a pause, Leonardo Lombardi. Leonardo's breath caught. He blinked, unsure if he'd heard right. Applause rose again as he walked slowly to the stage. A ribbon was placed around his neck. The medallion gleamed gold, but it wasn't the shine that mattered. It was what it meant. He had been seen. As he turned back toward the audience, he saw Isabella smiling through tears. And beside her, Julian stood tall, not as a businessman, but as a father. Later, backstage, Leonardo sat to remove his shoes, his muscles aching, but his heart light. That's when Santiago approached, the reigning champion, 2 years in a row. He held his trophy loosely, his tone surprisingly sincere. Not bad, Santiago said, nodding. Leonardo gave a small smile. Next year I'll win. Santiago smirked. We'll see. Outside the theater, the cool night air greeted them. Julian walked beside his son, not rushing, not lecturing, just present. How do you feel? He asked. Leonardo looked down at the medal, then up at his father. Proud, he said quietly. Julian nodded. Good. And as they walked toward the waiting car, Julian felt something he hadn't in years: hope. A bridge had been built between them, and he was ready to walk it, step by step. The ride home from the theater was quiet, but it was the kind of silence that didn't feel heavy. It felt full. Leonardo sat in the back seat, medal resting gently in his lap, his eyes tired yet bright. Julian glanced at him through the rearview mirror more times than he cared to admit, each time seeing a piece of his son he had never known existed. There was light in Leonardo now, confidence, resilience, purpose. And all of it, Julian realized, had bloomed from a garden he hadn't tended. Back at the estate, Julian poured himself a glass of scotch and stood by the window of his study, looking out at the moonlit garden. It was the same garden where he had first seen Isabella teaching Leonardo to dance. At the time, he'd seen it as a threat to his order. Now he saw it as the beginning of his son's transformation. He hated to admit it, but he had been wrong about Isabella. Wrong about what his son needed, and wrong about himself. The next morning, Isabella was already in the kitchen preparing breakfast. She was humming softly, flipping pancakes, unaware of Julian standing in the doorway watching her. The apron wrapped around her waist, the way she moved, composed, graceful, quietly focused. It struck him that she was still a dancer in spirit, even if she no longer called herself one. When she turned and saw him, she froze just for a beat. "Signor Lombardi," she said cautiously. He stepped inside. "I owe you an apology," Julian said, voice low, steady. "I doubted you. I questioned your presence in my home, but I saw something last night that I can't unsee." She waited, unsure what to say. "I saw my son come alive because of you." Isabella blinked, then looked away, focusing on the pan. "I didn't do it for you," she replied softly. "I did it for him." "I know," Julian said. "That's why it matters." He paused, then continued. "If you're still willing, I'd like you to keep training him." Isabella turned, eyes narrowing slightly. "You're sure?" "I'm sure," Julian nodded. "No conditions, no interference. Just give him what I didn't know he needed." Isabella exhaled slowly, a quiet relief settling in her expression. "I will," she said. "Gladly." For a moment, they simply stood there, not as employer and employee, not even as adversaries, but as two people bound by the same hope for Leonardo's joy, his growth, his future. And for Julian, it was a beginning, not just of letting go, but of learning how to trust, how to soften, how to listen. The evening sun cast golden light through the tall windows of the library, filling the space with a warmth that neither books nor fire could offer on their own. Julian sat in his leather armchair, an untouched glass of whiskey on the side table. His gaze wasn't on the fireplace or the rows of leather-bound books, but on the framed photograph he held in his hands. It was of her, Camilla, his late wife. He hadn't looked at this photo in years, not really looked, not without feeling like the world was collapsing from under him. A gentle knock interrupted the silence. "Come in," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Isabella stepped inside, her apron gone, dressed in a simple sweater and jeans, holding a steaming mug. She walked over, hesitating for a moment before offering the mug to him. "Chamomile," she said softly. "It helps with the kind of silence that keeps you awake." Julian accepted it with a nod. "Thank you." She was about to leave when his voice stopped her. "Do you know what she used to say?" he asked, eyes still on the photograph. Isabella turned slightly. "Who?" "My wife," he replied. "Camilla." Isabella sat in the nearby chair, not saying anything, just listening. Julian smiled, but it was a sad, tired smile. "She used to tell me that discipline is only noble when it's tempered by love. And I used to laugh. I thought she was just being sentimental. I believed in structure, in precision, in rules." He looked up, his eyes meeting Isabella's. "But when she died, all I had left were the rules." There was a long pause before he continued. "I didn't know how to comfort Leonardo. I didn't know how to talk to him about grief. So I gave him order, structure, silence. I thought if I could keep everything predictable, maybe we wouldn't break. Isabella said nothing. She let the words breathe. I see now, Julian added, voice cracking slightly, that all I did was build walls. Around myself, around him. The clock on the mantel ticked softly in the background. Outside, the sky was deepening to twilight. He doesn't remember her the way I do, Julian whispered. And I kept her memory so locked away. I'm afraid he never had a chance to really know her. He looked at Isabella, his voice barely above a whisper now. I don't know how to fix that. Isabella's reply was gentle, but firm. Maybe it's not about fixing, Signor Lombardi. Maybe it's about letting yourself feel again. For his sake, and yours. Julian looked back down at the photo, her soft eyes frozen in time. For the first time in over a decade, he didn't look away. It started subtly. At first, Julian only watched from the sidelines, arms crossed, face unreadable, as Isabella corrected Leonardo's form, as his son moved with increasing confidence and grace across the polished wooden floor. But over time, Julian's presence shifted. He wasn't just observing anymore. One afternoon, as Isabella finished demonstrating a particularly complex routine, Julian stepped forward. Leonardo, he said, clearing his throat, when you land that turn, your left foot slides too far out. It throws off your balance. Leonardo blinked at him. You saw that? Julian nodded. I've been watching. A grin tugged at the corners of Isabella's mouth, though she said nothing. Julian's involvement grew day by day. He began showing up early, holding water bottles, adjusting the mirrors for better angles, even cueing the music when Isabella needed both hands free. He asked questions about tempo, timing, posture, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to understand. He was trying in his own quiet way to bridge the space he had once helped widen. And Leonardo noticed. One evening after a long session, the boy approached his father, sweat dampening his brow. Dad, he said, can I ask you something? Julian looked up from the notes he'd started keeping in a small, leather-bound notebook. Of course, Leonardo hesitated. Why are you helping now? I mean, you never used to come watch me do anything. Not even soccer. Julian's hand froze over the notebook. I think I was scared, he admitted. Leonardo looked surprised. You? Ooh, scared? Julian nodded slowly. Yes, scared that if I got too close, I'd break something I couldn't fix. But I was wrong. Staying away didn't protect anything. It just kept me from seeing how amazing you are. Leonardo didn't say anything. He just threw his arms around his father. Julian stiffened just for a second, then closed his arms around his son, holding him tighter than he had in years. That hug said everything neither of them had dared to before. From then on, the trio became inseparable in the evenings. Julian worked with Isabella to structure training sessions. He brought in a professional choreographer for a weekend workshop at Isabella's suggestion, and even arranged for Leonardo to practice on an actual stage once a week. He wasn't just a father now. He was part of the journey. The competition loomed, but instead of dread, their small team felt focused, empowered. It was more than just training. It was healing. The night before the tournament arrived with a quiet intensity that neither Julian nor Leonardo could ignore. The house was unusually still, no kitchen clatter from Isabella, no echo of Dan's shoes across the floor. Just the sound of rain tapping gently against the windows and the steady rhythm of Julian's breath as he stood outside Leonardo's bedroom door. He knocked once. Come in, came the soft reply. Leonardo sat on the edge of his bed, already dressed in his warm-ups. His duffel bag sat by the door, packed and ready. He looked up at his father, and for a moment Julian was struck by how grown-up his son looked. Still just 12, but his eyes, they held something deeper now. Determination. Resolve. You can't sleep either? Julian asked, stepping inside on Leonardo shook his head. I keep playing it in my head, every step, every beat. Julian sat down beside him. That's good. It means you're prepared. Leonardo looked down at his hands. What if I mess up? Julian didn't answer right away. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled something out. A small, worn music box, the kind you had to wind by hand. This belonged to your mom, Julian said quietly, placing it in Leonardo's hands. She used to listen to it when she was nervous. She said it reminded her that even when life spins out of control, there's still a rhythm somewhere, waiting to be heard. Leonardo stared at the box, his fingers gently brushing the delicate metal. I don't remember her much, he whispered. Julian's voice cracked. She would be so proud of you. Leonardo turned to him. Are you? Julian swallowed hard, then placed a hand on his son's shoulder. I already am. Not because you're dancing tomorrow, not because you might win, though that would be wonderful. I am proud because you had the courage to try, to care, to believe in something. Leonardo's eyes shimmered. Thanks, Dad. They sat in silence for a while, just listening to the rain and the soft ticking of the music box in Leonardo's lap. Finally, Julian stood. Get some sleep. Big day tomorrow. Leonardo nodded, winding the music box slowly. A soft lullaby floated into the air. Dad? He called just as Julian reached the door. Julian turned. I'm glad you're coming. Julian smiled, soft, honest, rare. There's nowhere else I'd rather be. The morning of the tournament arrived dressed in gold and anticipation. Sunlight spilled through the windows of the Grand Theater, casting long shadows across the polished floors of the rehearsal halls. Nervous energy clung to the walls like static. Every breath, every step, every whispered prayer was charged with it. Leonardo stood backstage, tucked into a quiet corner with his headphones on, eyes closed, head gently nodding to a rhythm only he could hear. Isabella stood a few feet away, arms crossed, her face calm but her fingers twitching. Julian, dressed in a charcoal gray suit, observed quietly from behind the curtains, his posture as rigid as ever. But inside, he was chaos. Lombardi, you're next, a stagehand called. Leonardo opened his eyes, took a breath, nodded. Isabella walked over and knelt to his level, adjusting the collar of his crisp white shirt. This stage, it doesn't care about winning or losing, she said softly. It only wants your truth. Leonardo swallowed hard. And if my truth isn't enough? She smiled. Then you dance anyway, for yourself. Julian stepped forward. He didn't say anything at first. He simply put his hand on his son's shoulder, giving it a firm, grounding squeeze. I'll be watching. Leonardo nodded, heart pounding like a war drum. Then the curtain rose. He walked onto the stage, the spotlight following him like a guardian. The audience was a sea of faces blurred by the brightness, but he could make out two figures in the front row. Isabella, his father. The music began. A slow, aching piano melody that trickled out like raindrops on a lonely street. Leonardo took the first step, then another, and suddenly he was no longer a boy on a stage. He was the music. He was the ache. He was every unspoken word and every moment he had bottled up since the day his mother left this world. He moved with a grace that belied his age, his lines clean, his timing sharp. But more than that, he danced with feeling. There was a moment, a small, weightless pause in the choreography, when he leapt into the air, arms outstretched, eyes closed. And when he landed, the audience gasped. Because in that instant, it wasn't just a boy dancing, it was a memory. a dream, a son reaching toward the love he thought he'd lost. Julian gripped the edge of his seat, his throat tight. When the music faded, Leonardo stood in the center of the stage, chest heaving, cheeks wet with tears he hadn't even realized were falling. The crowd was silent for a breath. Then the applause came, thunderous, rising like a wave and crashing over him. Backstage, Isabella stood with her hands pressed together, eyes glassy, and Julian stood too. His hands didn't clap right away. They just hovered in front of him, shaking slightly. And then, slowly, reverently, he began to applaud. The results were announced in a velvet-lined hush. The theater, moments ago roaring with applause, now held its breath as the judge stepped forward with a sealed envelope in hand. Julian sat motionless, his fingers laced together so tightly his knuckles turned white. Isabella leaned forward, her gaze locked on Leonardo, who stood alone backstage with his hands pressed to his chest, feeling every beat of his heart as if it might shatter the silence. And now, the judge said into the microphone, the winner of this year's National Youth Dance Championship. The name that followed was not Leonardo's. A boy named Santiago Beltran, sleek and polished, stepped forward with a confident smile. He bowed, took the trophy, and waved as cameras flashed. Leonardo didn't move. His stomach dropped. He bit the inside of his cheek. To keep from letting the disappointment show, he could already hear the whisper of failure forming in his mind. You weren't enough. But then the judge raised a hand again. There is one more award, she said. This one is not about technique or perfect execution. It is about something more. Heart, soul, courage. This year, the Artistic Expression Award goes to, a pause, Leonardo Lombardi. Leonardo blinked. The room erupted again. This time, the applause wasn't polite. It was passionate, loud, real. He stepped forward, hesitant at first, and then with a growing sense of peace. A small medal was placed around his neck. Not gold, but silver and shaped like a flame. Julian stood, not because it was expected, but because he couldn't stay seated. As his son stood under the lights, flushed and tear-streaked and radiant with quiet pride, Julian realized something that caught him off guard. Winning had never mattered. Not really. For so long, he had measured life in margins, profits, and outcomes. But none of those things could match the sight of his son, standing tall in the center of that stage, transformed not by victory, but by vulnerability. Julian's eyes stung. He clapped. And when Leonardo looked at him and smiled, really smiled, he smiled back. The night air outside the theater was crisp and quiet, a stark contrast to the thunderous applause that had filled the auditorium only moments ago. Leonardo stood beside Julian, the metal cool against his chest, still processing what had just happened. Isabella lingered a few steps away, her arms gently crossed, a soft smile resting on her lips as she watched the boy she had helped lift from shadows into the light. She didn't step forward for praise. She didn't expect a thank you. She had done what needed to be done, because she believed in him. Julian glanced at his son, his posture tall, chin lifted with quiet pride, and then turned his eyes to Isabella. He walked toward her, his steps slow, deliberate. She turned as he approached, but said nothing. The streetlight cast a golden glow on her face, and for the first time, Julian truly saw her. Not as a cook, not as an employee, but as the woman who had reached into his broken home and pulled something beautiful from the wreckage. Thank you, he said, his voice low, steady. Isabella blinked. You don't have to. I do. He cut in gently. I need to. There was a silence between them, not uncomfortable but full, like 2 pages of a book finally turning together. I thought I knew what Leonardo needed, Julian continued, eyes still on his son. Stability, structure, safety, but I missed it entirely. Isabella followed his gaze. He needed to feel again. Julian nodded slowly. And you gave that to him. You reached him in a way I couldn't. You didn't just teach him how to dance. You reminded him how to live. Isabella looked down for a moment, her expression unreadable. He reminded me too. Julian's eyes met hers. A long breath passed between them. You didn't have to do any of it, he said, but you did. I didn't do it for you, she replied gently. I did it for him. I know, Julian said, and that's why it mattered. They stood in silence as Leonardo approached them, his eyes shining with hope and exhaustion. He grabbed Isabella's hand without hesitation, and Julian watched how naturally she accepted it. A small family, mismatched and unaffected, but somehow just right. The next few weeks unfolded like the first signs of spring after a long, harsh winter. Subtle at first, then undeniable. Julian Lombardi was changing. It wasn't sudden or dramatic. There were no grand declarations, no sweeping gestures. Instead, the shift appeared in the smallest corners of life. The way he lingered longer at the breakfast table, asking Leonardo about his day before reaching for his phone. The way he paused on the stairs when he heard laughter from the kitchen, a sound that had once felt foreign in the vast halls of the estate. One Saturday morning, Julian did something that stunned the entire staff. He made pancakes. They were burned on one side, too thick and lacking any real flavor, but Leonardo ate them like they were made of gold, grinning as syrup dripped down his chin. Isabella stood nearby, pretending not to laugh, though her eyes sparkled with delight. Julian smirked. I suppose I'll need a few more lessons in the kitchen. We'll start with how not to incinerate batter, she teased, tying her apron tighter. Julian leaned against the counter, watching her work with practiced ease. I've missed a lot, haven't I? Isabella glanced over her shoulder. You're here now. That one sentence settled deep into his chest. He hadn't realized how much he'd needed to hear it. Later that day, he joined Leonardo and Isabella in the garden, not to watch, but to move. At first, he stood off to the side, awkward and unsure. But when Leonardo held out a hand and said, "Come on, Dad, try it," something inside Julian shifted. He stepped onto the grass. It wasn't graceful. In fact, it was borderline comedic. But laughter, honest, full, unrestrained laughter, erupted from his son's chest, and Julian laughed too. Isabella clapped, not at the clumsy steps, but at the moment itself. It wasn't about dancing anymore. It was about daring to be vulnerable, about choosing connection over perfection. That evening, as the three of them sat in the den, a fire crackling gently in the hearth, Leonardo fell asleep curled against Julian's side. The boy's breath was slow, steady, and peaceful. Julian looked over at Isabella, who was curled up in an armchair, a book resting on her lap. She was watching the flames but seemed far away in thought. Do you ever think about going back? He asked quietly. She didn't look up. To dancing? He nodded. All the time, she whispered. And yet, you stayed. Now her gaze met his. Not everything broken needs fixing, Julian. Sometimes you find something new. And Julian sat with that, the warmth of the fire brushing his skin and the weight of his son against his heart. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when Julian made the decision. The leaves in the garden had turned shades of amber and rust, carpeting the lawn in the quiet hush of changing seasons. Inside the estate, laughter echoed from the library. Leonardo and Isabella were playing a board game, their voices weaving together like music. Julian stood at the threshold watching. For months, he had been observing, feeling, growing. Yet there was still something unsettled in his heart, a need he hadn't put into words. Until now. He waited until evening. The house was still, the silence comforting instead of suffocating for the first time in years. Isabella was in the kitchen, drying a cup with slow, thoughtful hands. Julian stepped in, unsure how to start. She looked up, sensing something in his posture. Everything all right? He nodded, then shook his head. Yes, no. I'm not short. Chotfish Mahidamam. She put down the cup, giving him her full attention. Julian? He drew in a breath. This house, it used to feel empty even when it was full. Now it finally feels like a home. And I realize it's because of you. She blinked, startled, but didn't interrupt. You've given Leonardo something I couldn't. Not just dancing, but laughter, joy. You remind him that it's okay to feel. And you've done the same for me. His voice caught slightly. I don't want that to go away. Isabella's eyes softened, but she still didn't speak. Julian stepped closer, his voice quieter now. You came here as a cook, but I don't see you that way anymore. You're part of this family, and I don't want this to end when the dancing ends. I want you to stay, not as staff, but as someone we care about, someone we need. She stared at him, heart hammering in her chest. Are you asking me to be your employee with a fancier title? She whispered, trying to mask the storm inside her. He smiled gently. No, I'm asking you to stay as yourself, as Isabella, as the woman who changed both of our lives. For a moment, her walls held, the same walls that had protected her heart for years. But then they cracked. I never thought I'd find this, she said, voice trembling. Not after Adrian, not after the stage. You did, Julian said softly, right here, with us. She stepped forward. He reached out, tentatively, reverently, and took her hand. And in that quiet kitchen, with nothing but the hum of evening around them, Isabella Ruiz said the simplest word with the deepest meaning. Yes. Julian, Isabella, and Leonardo form a new kind of family, learning to heal, trust, and love again. Together, it began slowly, like sunlight melting frost on a cold morning. After Isabella agreed to stay, things didn't instantly change, but they did. Soften. The edges of the estate, once rigid and formal, began to feel lived in. Julian found himself lingering at the breakfast table longer than usual, just to listen to Isabella hum while she poured coffee. Leonardo stopped shutting his door in the evenings and instead wandered into the living room, asking to play cards or share stories from his day. There were no grand declarations, no official titles, just quiet understanding and a growing warmth that filled every corner of their lives. Julian was still Julian, stoic, exacting, a man who measured success in numbers and strategies. But now he found value in things he couldn't quantify, like the sound of his son's laughter at dinner, or the way Isabella looked at him when he walked into a room. One evening, Leonardo fell ill, just a fever and chills, but it was enough to rattle Julian's world. He had never felt so powerless, pacing the hallway outside his son's room like a man without a map. But Isabella, calm and experienced, nursed the boy through the night. Julian watched from the doorway, his heart aching, not just with worry, but with gratitude. In that moment, he realized something he hadn't said aloud yet. He loved her, not just for what she had done for Leonardo, not just because she had brought life back into their home, but because she had seen the man behind the empire, the father behind the stern exterior, the lonely heart behind the control. Weeks passed. Leonardo grew stronger, and one morning, over warm toast and orange juice, he looked at Julian and asked, Is Isabella going to stay forever? Julian glanced at Isabella. She met his gaze, the ghost of a smile playing at her lips. I hope so, Julian replied softly, if she wants to. Leonardo nodded as if that settled something deep inside him, and so their days went on. They celebrated small victories. Leonardo mastering a complicated dance routine, Julian letting go of a business call to watch it. They navigated awkward moments, Julian burning toast while trying to surprise Isabella with breakfast, or Isabella losing her temper when Julian forgot to rest. And they embraced the quiet ones too, sitting on the porch as the sun went down, no words needed, just presence. Trust took time, so did healing. But love came quietly and grew like ivy, climbing over every crack, covering old scars with something green and full of life. One day, Isabella found Julian staring at an old photo of his late wife. "I still miss her," he confessed. "You always will," Isabella replied, "and that's okay." Julian reached for her hand. "But I'm here, with you, with him, and I wouldn't change that for anything." She squeezed his hand gently. Neither of them needed to say more. Because sometimes family isn't about who you're born to, but who stands by you when life breaks you open, who stays when it's messy, who dances with you in the dark and smiles with you in the light. Together, Julian, Isabella, and Leonardo became just that, a family. Not perfect, not traditional, but real. And finally, whole. Years later, if you were to ask Julian Lombardi what the greatest decision of his life had been, he wouldn't say building an empire or closing a $1 billion deal. He would say letting someone unexpected into his heart. Because love didn't come to him in a grand ballroom or behind a powerful handshake. It came quietly on a rainy afternoon through the soft sound of music and the laughter of a boy who had forgotten how to smile. Isabella Ruiz had walked into his life as a cook, but she stayed as something far more, proof that grief doesn't have to define the rest of your days. That healing doesn't mean forgetting, and that love, real love, often begins not with fireworks, but with shared silence and patient presence. Leonardo, once quiet and withdrawn, now danced across stages with pride, not because he sought trophies, but because he had been given the freedom to feel again, to fail, to try. And Julian? He became the kind of man who could sit in the front row, not to control, not to judge, but simply to believe. Theirs was not a perfect story, but it was true. And in that truth, they found something that no wealth could ever buy: belonging.